Hello and greetings to you, church. It is good to be together with you for worship today, and I'm thankful for the technology that has made it possible. So, the song Lift Every Voice and Sing tells a story. This is a song that tells a story or a history of Black people's lives and experiences. The song tells a story of endurance and freedom, of joy and struggle. It tells a story of pain and liberation. It tells a story of past and present. It tells a story of faith and hope. The song was originally written as a poem in the year 1900 by James Weldon Johnson, and now more than 100 years later, this song is a story that is sung loudly and proudly by many Black people, not just during Black History Month, but throughout the year. And now many people consider this song, this story, to be the Black national anthem. Lift Every Voice and Sing is a story that has been shared from generation to generation. In today's scripture reading from Psalm 78, we hear the pride of the children of Israel in sharing their stories from generation to generation. The ancestors were commanded to teach their children so that the next generation may know them, children yet unborn, and rise up to tell them to their children so that they may set their hope in God. This generation was reminded what their ancestors had told them, things that they had heard and known, and they were ensuring that their stories would be told. But what about us? Do we know our stories of faith and our stories of culture? Do we know our histories? And who will be sure to pass these important stories along to the next generation? Stories are important, and that's partially why it's so important to honor Black history in church and society. And of course, Black history is Canadian history, and so is a part of all of our past and all of our stories. And perhaps this is part of the story that we can continue to tell to the next generations. Black history, of course, includes the stories of people in the African diaspora, the variety of expressions from all over continental Africa, the stories of voluntary and forced migration. A focus on Black History Month or African Heritage Month seeks to be inclusive of the diversity of historical experiences of the Black communities in Canada. Of course, Black history includes the stories of Black loyalists from the 1700s who were runaway slaves who sought protection under the British and who served the Loyalist cause. Black history also includes people who moved with the Underground Railroad. Black history includes unearthing stories that have not yet been told. And Black history includes harsh stories of brutal enslavement and its legacy, of lynchings, of dehumanizing conditions, and of racial exclusion. But there's a funny thing about stories. In telling these stories and passing them on from generation to generation, sometimes we may not want to claim stories as part of who we are. Sometimes we may hesitate in telling the whole story, especially if those stories are difficult ones. Some of you may know that I work at the National Office of the United Church of Canada. I'm currently the Anti-Racism and Equity Officer, and my broad portfolio includes a focus on working towards dismantle systemic racism in all of its forms in church and society. It's a broad mandate. I've been working at the national office for some time, and several years ago, before I started in this position, someone had called me to talk about a Black History Month resource that I had written for the United Church. And this particular person was angry about the wording I had chosen. And the person picked up on this particular sentence in the resource. This is a quote. The development of Black History Month dates back to 1926 when Dr. Carter G. Woodson, an African-American historian, proposed a Negro History Week at a time when Black peoples were legally segregated, exploited, and treated as subhuman. That's the end of the quote. Now, I would note that all of that historic information is correct. That is part of our history and our story. That part of our history and our story is true. But the person who called me said quite emphatically that they did not think we should ever, no, not ever, talk about a time when Black peoples were legally segregated, exploited, and subhuman. The person went on to say that they did not think we should ever discuss the negative aspects of Black history. Rather, Black History Month should only be a time of celebration. We had a good conversation that day, and I very much appreciated what the person had to say, but I respectfully disagreed with them. Yes, indeed, I do believe that Black History Month is a time to honor the many contributions of people of African descent to church and society. And parts of the month are almost always about celebrating successes, and this is right and good. But we cannot celebrate the successes of the present without naming the struggles in the past. We cannot name the hardships of yesterday without also naming the challenges today, or without recommitting ourselves in the ongoing efforts towards racial justice. We cannot think that the hardships are over, but instead, we need to continually recognize that there is still a great deal of work to do in the ongoing work towards racial equity. We cannot ignore the intergenerational legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and the reality of anti-Black racism today. And yet we cannot forget the resistance, the resilience, and the realizations of Black people in the present. It's a complicated mix. Even as we look into the past, we are called to remember that the past was not struggle and that there were successes there. And even as we think about the present, we cannot only think about the successes, but we also need to acknowledge that there are struggles now too. We have come a long way, but we still have a very, very long way to go. And perhaps these stories of struggle and persistence are part of what we can tell to the next generation. One part of our collective story as Christians is the story of Jesus. And part of the story of Jesus is rooted in inclusion and exclusion. Now, it may seem like the story of the genealogy of Jesus, as read earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, is not necessarily a common one for this time of year. So why tell this particular story, which appears essentially as a long list of names? Well, one, because it is also a story of ancestors, and it too tells a part of his story. And two, because that long list of names includes women. Interestingly enough, there's another genealogy of Jesus in the 3rd chapter of Luke that is all men. But broader than gender inclusivity alone, Matthew's gospel includes the names of people who were prostitutes and liars and bullies and thieves. There were children of incest, children of mixed races, and children of adultery. We are reminded that Jesus' ancestors were diverse and imperfect. We are reminded that Jesus' story includes a seemingly colorful past that some might try to erase or pretend never existed. And we are reminded that for each of us, our stories are formed by our past, but the meaning of that past may not necessarily fully determine our futures. There's a popular photo and statement that was making its way around social media a few years ago during Black History Month that also reminded us of past and present. And the photo said, they did not steal slaves. They stole scientists, doctors, architects, teachers, entrepreneurs, astronauts, parents, teachers, children, and more, and made them slaves. Friends, there's not a single story of our past and not a single way in which the story can be told. And sometimes there are stories which are untold. I know for me, growing up, I longed to hear about how my own African history and heritage was reflected in the biblical story. But this story was not told to my generation. One story that is often not told is the prominence of Black peoples in the Bible as part of the story of Christianity. And I wonder why many do not know this part of the story. A United Church minister named Anthony Bailey, some of you may know him, he's in Ottawa as well. He has researched and written about the presence of Black peoples in the Bible. And in one such case, he wrote that the Old Testament often references Egypt, Ethiopia, and Cush. But what has not generally been understood within most of the worldwide Christian community, including some of our very own churches, is that all of these territories were populated primarily by Black peoples. In scripture, for example, we read about the great leader Nimrod, the son of Cush. We hear about the appropriate pride in the identity in the voice and cadence of the Shulamite woman in Song of Songs, who says, I am Black and beautiful. Isaiah referred to the people of Cush as a mighty and powerful nation with a people tall and smooth skinned. The prophet Amos states that Ethiopia, like Egypt and other nations, receive favor of God. And quote, are not you Israelites the same to me as the Ethiopians, declares the Lord. Even a prophetic book of the Bible was most likely written by a Black person. Quote, the word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi. So in other words, a Cushite, a Black person. And later on in the book of Zephaniah, the prophet declares on behalf of God, from the beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, or Cush, my worshipers, my scattered peoples will bring me offerings. There are many other references to the presence, leadership, and contributions of Black peoples in the Bible. But who knows this story? Now I'll confess that there are some times when I think about this, the stories that we do not know, sometimes I lament. I lament that there are so many stories that remain hidden and stories that are not passed on from generation. I lament that sometimes it seems hopeless in trying to reclaim stories from the past and bring them to the present. I lament that a rich history and heritage is too often untold, unacknowledged, and even forgotten. Personally, I have not forgotten parts of my own story. And part of my own story is one of living with the reality of anti-Black racism. Part of my story includes being told that my hair is too nappy, or my lips are too thick, or that my skin is too dark. Part of my story is that being told that despite being a straight A student, that there were educators who discouraged me from applying to universities because my people are better off doing other things. Part of my story is always being asked where I'm really from, even if I assert that I was born in Canada. Part of my story is that people are surprised that I can be articulate even though I'm Black. And part of my story is continually struggling for a place to belong in the church and wishing that some of my cultural songs and stories could be regularly heard in worship and not just during Black History Month. Part of my story is being called a credit to my race. Part of my story includes being tokenized, labeled, called names, and challenged when speaking. Part of my story includes being caught up in systemic racism and discrimination. But this is much more than my own individual story. My story is an example of an individual experience in the broader systemic nature of anti-Black racism in Canada. But I've observed that many among us in Canada live in a haze where we are shocked by incidents of overt racism and generally congratulate ourselves that our racism is not as bad as the United States. Award-winning journalist, activist, and Black Canadian Desmond Cole has something to say about this. He was on CBC about a year ago to talk about his new book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. And Desmond Cole is a person who's written prolifically about systemic racism in Canada, and in particular, the practice of police carding. And one of the things he says is he does not understand why Canada continues to be surprised by its own racism. He says that, quote, the conversation about race in Canada needs to move away from whether racism exists and focus instead on the reality of living under it. Desmond Cole asserts that anti-Black racism is all-encompassing in Canada. He says that we should not congratulate ourselves that we do not live in the United States, but we could follow the example of people in the United States some of whom are working to dismantle the structures that continue to hold Black people back. So we are partway through the United Nations decade for people of African descent. And this decade runs from 2015 to 2024. And in proclaiming this decade, the international community recognizes that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. And as part of the decade, a United Nations working group of a United Nations working group of experts on people of African descent visited Canada in October 2016. And they focused specifically on the realities of anti-Black racism in Canada. And following their visit, they wrote a lengthy report with many recommendations, some of which will parallel some of the things that Desmond Cole was saying as well. And one part of the report from the United Nations says that Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation, and marginalization has been toxic for Black people. Across the country, many people of African descent continue to live in poverty and poor health, have a lower educational attainment, and are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. The report also says that the experience of African Canadians is unique because of the particular history of anti-Black racism in Canada, which can be traced back to slavery and its legacy through specific laws and practices enforcing segregation in education, residential accommodation, employment, and other economic opportunities. And finally, the report also says that anti-Black racism and racial stereotypes are so deeply entrenched in institutions, policies, and practices that its institutional and systemic forms are either functionally normalized or rendered invisible, especially to the dominant group. The United Nations talks about how Black people in Canada are still among the poorest and most marginalized groups in the country. Black people too often experience discrimination in accessing justice, face alarmingly high rates of police violence and racial profiling. Now, I would note that this is not about individual Black people. We could all likely name individual Black people who are rich or who have for whom some of these things do not apply. It's not about an individual, but rather the decade, and the United Nations is declaring that holistically as a group, Black people around the world, including Canada, are disproportionately affected by these issues in relation to other groups. And the cause of these are systemic. This reality too, is part of our story. And this might just be the part of the story where some among you may start to be feeling a little bit uncomfortable, or perhaps it's the first time that you've heard this part of the story, or some among us may be feeling sorry for these experiences or feeling guilty, or may want to deny these realities or explain them away as things that do not normally happen in our nice, polite Canadian society. A friend of mine who happens to be white recently wrote about how to react when hearing the stories of people who are Black and people who come from other minority groups. And he said that when Black people and other people tell their stories of racism and discrimination, the first thing is to believe them. And then to work to be an ally who will be in solidarity. He said two additional things. One, I need to be willing to show up when I'm asked. That can be hard because I like to get things right the first time, and I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. But if I'm not going to show up when I'm asked, my solidarity is abstract and absent. The second thing he says, I have been urged to understand more of how racism persists and perpetuates, and to pass this challenge and knowledge on to others. Friends, this too is part of our story, and this too is about passing along stories to the next generation. I recall that the psalmist said that we tell our story so that the next generation should set their hope on God and not forget the works of God. We tell our stories, friends, to remind ourselves that in the midst of struggle, God is always there. We tell our stories to be more faithful people of God. So, in the midst of these hard stories and ongoing struggles, where do we begin to find hope? I'll offer you three thoughts. One, briefly, is a place for hope, I think, is remembering Sankofa. And Sankofa is a West African word that comes from the Akan people of Ghana, West Africa. And Sankofa embodies past, present, and future. It's translated by some as returning to your roots, recapturing what you have lost, and moving forward. Others translate it as no matter how far away one travels, one must always return home. Sankofa signifies timelessness in identity, recalling the past and looking towards the future. And some might summarize it as our past informs our today to shape our tomorrow. A character often associated with this concept is the Sankofa bird of passage, who looks behind even though it's constantly looking forward. And so remembering the stories of old can keep us focused on the future. Sankofa reminds us of the importance of storytelling and sharing stories with the next generation. Perhaps remembering keeps our focus on who we are and where we are going. We can perhaps better discern the future by remembering the past. And we just might be less likely to repeat mistakes of the past by remembering what has happened before. By telling and retelling our stories from the past, we offer hope for tomorrow. So for me, there's hope that through concepts like Sankofa, all peoples might remember and reclaim the rich and inspiring histories of Black peoples in church and in our biblical history. A second place for hope, I think, is the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. And for me, the hope is that countries around the world are being asked to propose concrete measures that promote their full inclusion, to promote their full inclusion and to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. For me, there's hope that the Prime Minister announced that the Government of Canada will officially recognize the decade and remarked that Canadians must realize that anti-Black racism and unconscious bias do exist in this country. For me, too, there's hope that the United Church is among the churches who are engaging the decade. And for me, by focusing on concrete action in our churches and in our country and in countries around the world, well, that's a cause for hope. And for me, a third place of hope is the anti-racism policies and the work of the United Church of Canada, the work of the people of the United Church of Canada. One line from the United Church's policy says that we believe that change is possible. We believe in forgiveness and reconciliation and transformation and the potential to learn from stories and experiences. And for me, of course, there's hope that the United Church has recently made a commitment to becoming an anti-racist denomination, and that there are many people from across the church who are determined to keep working together on dismantling systemic racism in church and society. My friends, we can learn from stories. And to learn from stories, that community has to be willing to receive those stories, even the difficult ones of racial exclusion that can make us feel uncomfortable. These too are part of who we are. The community of people in Canada is called to perhaps recognize and realize that stories about Black history in all its forms need to be told. So, my friends, what stories do you listen to? What stories do you tell? How do you attend to your own story? And how might God be inviting you to examine your story in perhaps new ways? I'll close by just sharing that I believe that the church is the keeper of the Christian story. And so perhaps it is up to us, to all of us as people of faith, to ensure that the diverse stories of faith are passed on to the next generation, and that these stories are told again and again and again and again. It is up to us to ensure that our biblical story, the whole story, is also told again and again. We have heard some stories today. May we retell them so that they do not get lost. And in looking back, may we discern the way forward with God being our helper. Who will tell the story? It is my prayer that together we will. Thanks be to God. Amen.